freedom of speech,
fundamental rights,
freedom of conscience,
academic freedom,
freedom of press,
and the right to listen.
You're listening to So to Speak, the free speech podcast, brought to you by FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education.
Welcome back to So to Speak, the free speech podcast, where every other week we take an uncensored look at the world of free expression through personal stories and candid conversations. Today I'm reporting from FIRE's Philadelphia studio. Came down from New York City this morning. And it's Friday, May 11th, but by the time I think people hear this podcast, it'll be later in the month. And that's because I am pre-recording some podcasts with my colleague Aaron over here, because I'm heading out of the country to Scotland next week. Yeah, so I won't be recording podcasts there, but I will be drinking whiskey and Islay, or Isla, I think is how it's pronounced, pretending I know how to golf at St. Andrews. I do not know how to golf. It's been, I think, 15 years since I did that. But I will hopefully be walking in the footsteps of David Hume and Adam Smith in Edinburgh, people I assume our guest today knows something about. We're joined by Professor Keith Whittington, who is the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Politics in the Department of Politics at Princeton University. And notably, he is the author of a new book, Speak Freely, Why Universities Must Defend Free Speech. Thanks for being here, Professor.
Thanks for having me.
We're also joined by a recurring, so to speak, guest, my colleague, of course, Samantha Harris, who is FIRE's Vice President of Policy Research. Now, it's my understanding, Sam, that you and Professor Whittington know each other?
Yes, I was a student of Professor Whittington's at Princeton almost 20 years ago, which I like to say is amazing because I'm only 25, but you know. But yeah. So one of the first, so it was in the politics department at Princeton that I really developed my interest in constitutional law, and my first exposure to that was in a constitutional interpretation class that I took with Professor Whittington, and he was also my junior paper advisor, although if you held a gun to my head, I probably could not tell you what that paper was about.
And I doubt you remember.
No, I did not.
Did you spend a lot of time on the First Amendment in that class?
Not a ton, probably. I was just started teaching that class, and I mostly borrowed the syllabus my colleagues had used for the class and made only modest adjustments to it. And there was some First Amendment, but I don't think a tremendous amount of First Amendment.
No, because it was sort of one of two classes. There was a civil liberties class, too, which I also took that got into the First Amendment issues a lot more. But those two classes together were like the constitutional law department of the Princeton Politics Department.
Well, it's the constitutional law department, I guess, of Princeton. Princeton doesn't have a law school, right?
That's right, no law school.
Why is that? Is there a reason?
It's a very undergraduate-focused institution, so so everything it has has a large undergraduate component, and law schools are hard to fit into that model. And so it has an architecture school, but the architecture school is very undergrad-focused. It has a public policy school, but it's very undergraduate-focused. So things that are sort of purely graduate professional schools, Princeton mostly is avoided.
Oh, really? Yeah, my understanding.
Yeah, there's no medical school or business school or anything like that.
My understanding is that law schools are kind of piggy banks for some schools. I guess they bring in a lot of money, or used to. I know there's a decline in enrollment these days.
Yeah, it used to be. I think now they tend to be more of a drain on universities, but for a long time they were a bit of a piggy bank. And Princeton has toyed with the idea off and on of having a law school. But,
oh, really?
Yeah, no, it's sort
That's
of a recurring interest, and they always wind up backing away from it. In part, there's some nervousness about starting one because you want to make sure it's a good one if it's going to be a Princeton Law School, and so the investment to start one. And there's a real concern about how it would affect the culture of the place to create a law school that was so different than everything else on campus.
Well, I guess that makes sense if you're an undergraduate-focused campus, avoiding that mission creep that comes with expanding into investments in graduate programs.
The alumni are very concerned about avoiding mission creep.
Yeah.
That's something we are very focused on here at FIRE, too. So.
Anyone who's at a nonprofit.
And it can be a challenge. It's important to keep focused on what the core mission is and try to stick with it, because it's easy to let things get away from you.
Yeah, well, thanks for driving down here to Philadelphia
My
today
pleasure.
To talk about your book, Speak Freely. I'm interested, this is the most boring question that an interviewer can ever ask anyone, but I'm interested in why you decided to pursue this book? Because there have been a couple of books on this topic. Gilman and Chemerinsky, for example, have one that came out at almost the same time as yours. So why did you decide? Was there something you had seen at Princeton that gave you cause for concern, or?
I think less at Princeton than other places. It'd been sort of bubbling up in my head for quite some time, I think, as I worried both about specifically free speech issues and that you sort of see across the nation as a whole, sort of at other universities, more really than Princeton, of conflicts over free speech, universities being more restrictive of free speech than they ought to, students engaged in behavior that I thought was potentially inappropriate in terms of how they engage in protest and the like. And in that context, I was looking around for something we could use at Princeton to sort of help guide students through some of these issues. And one thing I was a little frustrated by was there didn't seem to be a book that really focused on the normative issues. Why should you care about free speech? Why should you value it? What were the principles that you ought to be committed to? Instead, a lot of the books talking about campus free speech issues were more descriptive of problems that had occurred. And so I was a little surprised there didn't seem to be anything that was very normative that really laid out the principles and tried to apply them to this context, and so eventually I decided, well, maybe I'll try writing one then. And the other concern I'd had that sort of been building over time was sort of a concern about the appreciation of universities that politicians and parents and even students seem not to fully understand what universities are really all about, what the core mission of a university was. And I think that has negative consequences in lots of other contexts, but it also has implications for thinking about free speech. And so in the background was this sort of longer concern about do people really appreciate why colleges exist, what they do, what you ought to do when you get there? And so the book was a way of trying to pull those two things together. I should note that Howard Gilman is a sometimes co-author of mine who wrote with Erwin Chemerinsky a campus free speech book, and I was unaware that Howard was actually working on it at the time. And so I see he's now a chancellor at University of California at Irvine, and I sent him a draft of the manuscript in part to get his perspective from the position of a leader in higher education about how to think about these issues. And he said, "What happens? I have a book that's sort of in process."
No way.
And so it's like, oh, that's awkward.
Well, I mean, let's start at the beginning. And Sam, I want to get your perspective on this. What is the mission of a university? You're at a private university, Princeton, so it's not bound by the First Amendment. It's bound by whatever values it has laid out as guiding principles, and FIRE's position is that to the extent it promises free speech, it should live up to those principles. I heard a podcast with Sam Harris and Nicholas Christakis from
not
Yale.
me, the other Sam Harris.
The other Sam Harris. This is Samantha Harris. We did a debate earlier in the month, and we were concerned one of the debaters couldn't be there. The most famous one, Andrew Sullivan. He ended up pulling through for us, but Sam was our stand-in, and we were like, we could just say Sam Harris is standing in, and people think it's the Sam Harris.
And if Sam Harris is listening to this, we still want you to come on this podcast. I want to interview you for this podcast and do Sam Harris on Sam Harris. That's like my...
Yeah, well, we reached out to him. If we have any listeners out there that can get in touch with him, we run so many of those circles we run in. He's I guess running in as well, but he's maybe running in different directions because we're never running into each other. But we'd love to have him on here. So the purpose of a university, Nick Christakis on Sam Harris's podcast said, in his mind, it's the dissemination, preservation, and creation of knowledge. And for those of us who care about free speech, it's in the marketplace of ideas. You almost can't do those three things without those values in place. But there are other universities, such as Liberty, Brigham Young, that have a theological mission that place certain theological precepts and principles above I guess, the search for truth wherever it leads, because their opinion would be, well, to the extent that we believe in a creator and there's any evidence against that, that runs contrary to our mission. So I'd like to hear from both of you about that, and then we can take that next step and look at the principle of free speech more generally.
Right.
Well, for me, generally, I think, and I want to be specific here, that I'm talking about what I would call sort of a traditional four-year liberal arts university. I mean, obviously, there are many colleges where you go to prepare for a very specific career, and so
Trade
the
schools.
Goals, right? The goals there may be different, but when I think of sort of the conventional liberal arts college experience, I think ideally it should not only give students a broad grounding in a lot of different ideas and parts of history and things like that, but it should also teach students how to argue for their positions. Not what to think, but how to think in a way, how to argue. I mean, this is something I think, law school does very well, where you are often forced to take an argument you don't agree with, for example, in a moot court setting and argue it. And I fear that one of the worst side effects of the loss of free speech and the feeling that a lot of people, we did a poll recently where a lot of students reported self-censoring in the classroom, and we know some faculty, particularly faculty whose coursework touches on sensitive topics, are feeling those pressures too.
I want to talk about faculty, yeah.
I think one of the biggest losses there is that students are losing the opportunity to really sharpen their own argumentation skills and become the most effective advocates for whatever their positions may be. The way I've started to put it is, if all you know about a conservative's point of view is what you read in Mother Jones, and if all you know about a liberal's point of view is what you read on Breitbart, then you're really only getting sort of the most straw man version of that argument. And when you actually meet someone who's well-informed and thoughtful and makes a compelling argument for their point of view, you're going to come up short if you haven't had the opportunity to really meaningfully engage with views that you disagree with.
I love that point. I was at Nadine Strawson's book launch at Barnes & Noble in Manhattan, earlier this week, and I met a student at Columbia who's there as on a scholarship from some Scandinavian country, and she went back home and was talking with her brother who believes the earth is flat. He's an actual flat earther. I've never met one, right. But apparently her brother is. And I think there was a poll going around social media recently that found that like a surprising number of people believe the earth is flat. And she was talking about how he was presenting all of these arguments for why the earth is flat, and she had nothing to come back against him, because she's never been presented with those ideas. Right. She's never needed the rhetorical skills to confront something that we've just known to be false for centuries at this point. And John Stuart Mill talks about there's nothing more dangerous to an intellectual than the deep slumber of a decided opinion. And she was like, the one thing you can almost take for granted about conspiracy theorists, people who believe gravity doesn't exist or that the earth is flat, is that they're going to have the skills to argue against you, because you don't just arrive at that opinion at a whim. You've read all the arguments on the other side in the way that those of us who know that the earth is round have not. So it's
that's a good point.
So that was the first time anyone really had the experience that John Stuart Mill so eloquently talks about in On Liberty. But Professor Whittington, I want to hear your thoughts on the purpose of a university, and do you believe, as Sam believes, that free speech, the core of free speech's value to a university is mainly in the liberal arts institutions?
Yeah, I think the liberal arts institutions are sort of the classic starting point for thinking about it. But I do think if we think of the central mission of all universities, although they're going to pursue them somewhat differently, as being about advancing and disseminating knowledge, ultimately, then the ability to engage in skeptical inquiry, to test unconventional ideas, to be able to argue for those ideas in a classroom, to hear debate about a wide range of views, is crucial to that mission. And the liberal arts are the sort of classic home of that. And as I say, law schools are sort of very familiar with that kind of approach and thinking about arguing from both sides and being able to hear sort of the full range of positions. But it's also crucial ultimately to how the natural sciences operate and engineering operates and the like as well. They're asking different questions, but they're also concerned with trying to push the boundaries of what we know, to follow the trail of evidence wherever it leads, and then communicate what they've learned to others. And sometimes what they do is also deeply controversial, and they also need space then to be able to explore those ideas and push those ideas as far as they can. And so while the process of educating students in chemistry is going to look very different than the process of educating students in philosophy. And so there are going to be differences about how that plays out across different disciplines, for example, and as a consequence across somewhat different institutions. that's our core commitment, that what universities are all about and what everybody on campus is really committed to, of pursuing the truth as best you can in your particular area of interest, and then following the arguments and evidence wherever they go, even if that winds up overturning very cherished beliefs and ideas, if it winds up challenging conventional views, then that's part of what you ought to be doing, and it's appropriate. And as you say, some universities, I think, would try to cabin that a little bit. So religious institutions, for example, might say, well, look, there's some real boundaries on what we're willing to question here, and there are some things that are sort of off the table, and that's a limitation as to the extent to which those universities are fully committed to that core mission. But I think most other universities at least claim to be fully committed to that core mission, whether they're public universities or private universities, and so I think from a public university standpoint, you do have to worry about, so what does law require? What will some judge tell you have to do? But for those of us, for example, who live and work in private university campuses, there's still a good reason to care about free speech, and it's because of the project we're engaged with in that campus. And if we sacrifice those principles of free speech, we're ultimately going to be undercutting and subverting what it is we're trying to accomplish on the campus in the first place.
Yeah, one of the things I've noticed over the years of doing this work is that a lot of these conflagrations that we've seen happen surrounding freedom of speech have happened within the humanities departments. Right. You mentioned chemistry, right, biology. You don't see so much of the controversies stemming from those areas, perhaps because the arguments don't rest on people's identities so right much. And I think you would have expected me to bring this up, but there was a controversy at Princeton this past semester involving emeritus professor of anthropology, Lawrence Rosen, who was teaching a class called Anthropology 212, Cultural Freedoms, Hate Speech, Blasphemy, and Pornography. It was a class specifically devoted to discussions of taboo topics, right, controversial hate speech, blasphemy. Presumably the students knew this when they were going into the class, but he presented a theoretical scenario in the class, and I'm reading from Inside Higher Ed here, in which he asked students to think about cultural taboos as an introduction to the course. And he asked, which is worse, a white man physically assaulting a black man or calling him the N-word, to which I guess students took offense because he used the word nigger, and then walked out of the course, causing controversy on campus and ultimately the cancellation of the course. I should note that the chair of the anthropology department at Princeton, I believe also a woman of color, came to his defense vociferously. I mean, what she wrote about him was as eloquent a defense of free speech and pedagogy as I had ever seen. And Princeton itself came to his defense and I think urged him not to cancel the course, but he was an emeritus professor. Perhaps he just didn't want to deal with it. He was stepping in for a friend who I believe was ill or couldn't teach the class that year, but it speaks to some of the concerns that we've seen surrounding students' response to controversial speech. Right. Or we had a case at Brandeis, which Sam will very much remember, in which a professor, I forget what he was teaching, used the word wetback in the context of describing and criticizing what it means, and for that he had a monitor placed in his class, and he was found guilty of racial harassment. So it's I suspect, and you can speak to this better than I have, that professors have how will the students respond? It seems as though there needs to be a certain amount of resilience to approach these subjects, and we're seeing more and more students take offense to them. Right.
Yeah, I think that's a concern, right? I mean, that students come to classes with their own expectations and experiences, one thing we all be trying to do in universities is make sure students understand what it is they're getting into, and what they should be expecting when they're entering into classes, and how those classes are ultimately being conducted. So as you say, in that particular class, for example, Professor Rosen was teaching at Princeton. It was clear what the subject matter was, clear the kinds of topics that would have to be debated. I'm sure students were drawn to it precisely for that reason, but nonetheless, they didn't necessarily have a full expectation of what they were going to in fact encounter in that class. And That's probably not completely unreasonable. They're students. They haven't yet fully experienced what the range of classes are going to look like, and haven't seen everything that's going to take place in a classroom. But part of what we need to do is be able to convey to students that, look, you're going to be sometimes made uncomfortable in a class, especially on some kinds of topics. We're going to be exploring ideas and issues and language that you might find discomforting and unsettling and challenging in a very basic way. And if you're not willing to engage in that task, then maybe this isn't the right program for you or course of study for you. But if you're going to embark on it, you should recognize what it is you're getting into.
Yeah, Carolyn Rouse, who is the chair of the anthropology department,
Right.
was quoted in this Inside Higher Ed article as saying, we've met with students and they've recognized or said, all we need is scaffolding or more preparation. Not that the word shouldn't be used, but they need to know they can trust the professor to be able to hear it and not think he's presenting it as people who might really use it would, as a racial slur.
Right.
Sam, what was the reaction from alumni? Did you hear anything about this and the controversy that surrounded it? I also want to hear from you, Professor, about what people were saying on campus.
Right.
Yeah, I definitely discussed it with some alums. I think, generally speaking, I was just very disappointed that he so quickly canceled the course, because I think, one of the big problems right now is this self-censorship, both of students and faculty. And I think that, Princeton handled it very admirably. I really think so. I mean, we've seen far too many other schools, I think, leave faculty and students twisting in the wind for similar situations. So they handled it admirably, but someone at some point needs to be willing to withstand the pressure. When we talk about the importance of free speech on campus, we talk about the strong student model and students needing to be able to hear things that offend them. And I would say the same of faculty. I had an experience at Princeton. I went there to speak a couple of years ago now on a panel. I was on a panel with Peter Singer, and there was a student, I think editor of the Nassau Weekly maybe, and a student member of the Black Justice League, and it was a difficult conversation. I mean, people in the audience were pretty hostile to myself and Peter Singer, and in particular said some things to Peter Singer that really surprised me. But it was
what were they responding to? Just the argument for free speech in general?
The argument for free speech divorced from a discussion of power dynamics. This is an argument. I think it was one of the first times I had really heard it, but now it's one that we're really starting to see becoming more mainstream on campus. I'm thinking of like Ulrich Baer's editorial in the New York Times, that really the idea that censoring some people is necessary to level the playing field and allow other people to participate in the marketplace of ideas.
Well, this is the idea of Herbert Marcuse, the repressive tolerance idea, that neutral principles, which is what, the idea that we don't discriminate based on viewpoint, it gives the benefit to those already in power, to which the system already benefits. And whether you think that's a fair characterization of how the principle works, these students ultimately believe, therefore, that we need to, do a little bit more balancing with our principles. Professor, let's finish the story. What did the students say?
I was just going to say, it was an interesting experience for me because it was my first experience myself feeling really uncomfortable. I mean, it was, a lot of people in the audience were very hostile towards me. And I felt uncomfortable, and I had to stand up there and, continue making the arguments I believed in spite of feeling, very uncomfortable and very much like I was being judged for the positions I was holding. And it was, it definitely made me realize that, that discomfort that we ask students to feel, and that we ask, maybe faculty to feel if they're going to keep teaching a course that contains difficult material, is a real thing that people have to contend with, and it's not easy. So in some ways, I think as a free speech advocate, it was good for me to experience it, because it was a good, now I have a better sense of when we're asking that of other people, what are we asking of them when we are asking them to really feel uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it also showed me that, yeah, it can be done. I mean, I think the most disheartening thing to me about that experience, and it was one of the things that continues to concern me about, people arguing against free speech on campus, was that, they started asking a lot of questions that there weren't really time to answer, or that sort of were, taking us away from the panel discussion topic, and the moderator was trying to get us back on topic. And I said, listen, I'm free after the talk. Like, I want to hear more from you guys. I'd like to talk about this. If you want to talk about it afterwards, please stay. and no one did. And that's what was frustrating, is I feel like, I think on both sides of a lot of debates, people have this feeling that they've arrived at the truth. They don't need to hear the other side. It's not worth hearing. And that lack of an interest in dialogue, which, we saw repeated, for example, when Josh Blackman was recently protesters disrupted his speech at CUNY Law, and not only did they disrupt him, they disrupted someone who was there to engage with him, someone who was there to engage with him critically. They yelled at that student, "Stop debating." And, that kind of real sort of, no, we don't need to hear the other side. We don't need to engage with it. We know what's right, and you're wrong, I feel like is very, very dangerous on the college campus.
Someone drew a comparison, I think, surrounding the Christina Hoff Sommers protest. The effort to deplatform someone is really no different substantively from book burning. It's just the ideas are presented in the spoken form rather than the written form. And I think there's something to that. And you speak about how students have sort of arrived at the end of history, at that truth, to appropriate an essay written in the 1990s. And John Stuart Mill talks about this too. He says, to censor is to assume that your certainty is the same thing as absolute certainty. And I think that's runs directly contrary to what we would want from any intellectual, the idea that you're always keeping a skeptical mind, questioning your premises, and engaging with those with whom you disagree in order to bolster your ideas. But what was the response on Princeton's campus to this controversy? Do you think outside of the faculty, where did students land? And I hate to paint with a broad brush, of course.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know where students as a whole land on this. I think that I think lots of students as well as faculty sort of understood why the students in the classroom were sort of taken aback and upset by what they had encountered. It's a somewhat natural response. I think both students and faculty on campus were surprised then as to how the students expressed their surprise at what had taken place, and the
is faculty walking on eggshells? Do you feel?
I don't think in general. No, it's and I think part of what and I think that's part of the concern of what comes out of an episode like that is sort of what's the lesson learned, right? And so one concern is, well, the class got canceled, and so is the lesson learned that it's possible to shut down classes and shut down certain kinds of conversations if you find them inappropriate or offensive or disturbing in various ways. And I think the university has done as much as it can to try to emphasize that, look, this is on the table as a possibility of what can happen in classes. You should understand that and expect that, and if it's appropriate in the context of a particular class, then you should expect to encounter that kind of language and other language and other ideas that you're going to find offensive and challenging, and that's what we do at Princeton. And I think it's important for the university to be very firm about that and try to explain to students why that's true. And I think in that sense, then the faculty feel reasonably confident that the university itself has their back. I think the challenge is how students react, and I think but that's a general challenge of trying to teach in a classroom, right? That you don't want to lose your students, and you want to be able to lead them through the conversation you're trying to get them through, and you want them to grapple with the ideas and not simply run away from them, and so. You always have to be somewhat conscious of where the student's starting from and how do you get them to the point of being able to grapple with those ideas effectively. And, sometimes you fail in trying to make that effort, right? And so I think it's important then to be cognizant of sort of what these current students are thinking and where they're coming from. And I don't think that means, well, you don't try to get them to the ideas, you don't try to get them to those arguments, but does require some care as to how you move them along to the point of trying to grapple with the set of ideas you want them to grapple with.
Yeah.
I know I'm not the host, but can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, go for it.
Because this is something I'm really curious about, and it's just something I'm always trying to get at. Right. Do you get the sense, as someone who works with a lot of students, that there is something in the university environment that is encouraging students to take this, I have arrived at the truth view and I don't need to contend with opposing views? Or do you feel like they're arriving at college with that sense? Because that's something I feel like we're always trying to get at, is like, where is this coming from?
Well, there is a sense that we've lost an entire generation. This will be, my concern is that this generation, at least perception of free speech, will be shaped by Charlottesville. Right. And that's very concerning to me. And I have some colleagues here who are very worried about it as well, and saying, well, there's a concern about giving up on this generation and just shooting for the next one.
Right.
But I'll let you answer. I'll let you, which we can't do at Fire, because that would just be an abdication of everything that we stand for. But
well, I don't think you want to do it in general. I mean, it's the thing that really worries me about these campus free speech debates is not only what's immediately happening on the campus themselves, but what are the sort of ideas that are being shaped that's going to have consequences down the road, right? And so I think it's important that you not simply write off a generation of students and say, well, they're committed to a set of very problematic ideas, but eventually they'll graduate and move on, and they'll be fine. We'll worry about the next set, because eventually they will also become citizens and voters and
that's what Andrew Sullivan
and
says. He says, he made the argument in New York Magazine, which is why we put him on this debate we did in New York City the other day. Is there a campus free speech crisis? He said, we all live on campus right now. He said some of the norms that we've seen develop on campus surrounding due process and free speech are infiltrating our justice system and our corporations. And he said, the people who said, oh, it's just a phase, oh, it's just campus, this isn't the real world, he said, I'm seeing it in the real world, and I haven't been on campus in decades.
Right. Yeah, no, I don't think those things are contained. And so I think it's important to, part of what we all be doing at universities is to educate students to grapple with ideas seriously. And so I think it's important not to turn away from this and dismiss it as just a campus problem that has no larger implications. I think it will have larger implications. And I think likewise, it's important not to simply dismiss this particular generation of students as unusually sensitive or delicate, and that there are ideological issues at stake here in which there are real ideas and arguments that are at play, and some students are certainly persuaded and dug in some positions, and that's always true, right? You're always going to encounter advocates of positions on a whole host of issues who are dug in, and they aren't going to be very persuadable necessarily. But I think it's important not to lose sight of the fact that there is a much larger group of students in this case who aren't dug in, who don't know what they ought to think about these issues, and so they're open to hearing the arguments. Yeah. And so, it is the case. You're not necessarily going to persuade the people who have already come to a committed position, and they aren't necessarily looking to change that position or be open to conversation about how to modify it. But there's a much broader audience of students who don't have a firm position, who are just trying to figure these things out, and it's important to talk to them.
And they're a lot less vocal.
I had an interesting experience recently at, I did a KPCC, it was like an NPR LA live event specifically on the role of social media and free speech on the campus free speech debate. And there was a student on the panel, a student activist. And one of the things I realized listening to her talk, and it was just something that I think, those of us who are trying to convince current students of the value of free speech maybe need to be aware of, and I certainly feel like this was the first time I'd really thought about it, was, the role that social media plays. If you're a student activist now and you put yourself out there online, you are deluged with comments of a nature that a lot of us who say in theory, like, hate speech shouldn't be banned and things like that, have not personally been barraged with. And it made me realize that may be in part this crop of students is having a different experience with free speech because of social media and experiencing it in a way that we maybe didn't. And it made me realize that that's something that we need to, if we want to sharpen our arguments in favor of free speech, we need to consider what it's like to actually live with the kind of speech that exists on social media, which, when it's not harassment, when it's not threats, obviously I believe should be protected. But it's certainly, something that made me think and made me realize is perhaps informing the views of students in a way that I wasn't quite aware of.
Or just recognize who you're speaking to. I think part of the problem with social media is, especially when you're younger, you don't realize that what you're saying in these fora can reach potentially the entire world. And that's one of the promises, but also the worries about social media. I'm producing I think this is the first time I'm announcing it, a documentary about Ira Glasser, who was the executive director of the ACLU for 21 years, I believe, 78 to 2001. That's 23 years. I'm not good at math. That wasn't my major. But I'm asking a lot of these old school civil libertarians, people like Floyd Abrams, like Ira Glasser, like Joel Gora, what is your thoughts, or what are your thoughts about the internet? Because on the one hand, it's a beautiful way to access information and also disseminate information. In the same vein, it also allows for this, encourages this mob mentality and the tribalism that is so often the concerns of free speech advocates. And I think most of them, Aaron, you can correct me if I'm wrong, said it's too soon to say. They say a lot of the same concerns that we're having about social media right now were concerns that people had about the printing press and broadcast television.
Right.
There's always this sort of fear about new technology, and it takes a couple decades, if not a couple centuries, to sort of catch up with it and its consequences. But I just hope that how we deal with it takes a normative approach and not a legislative one, because I think that if we had the Communication Decency Act, Section 280 wasn't dealt with in the 90s, I think you would have seen very different internet today and a lot less innovation and economic growth as a result about it. But I think this conversation will continue at Princeton, because I have an article in front of me that it's a press release from Princeton that your book has been selected as the pre-read for 2018. It's a tradition, I'm reading from the press release here, that introduces first-year students to the intellectual life of the university by offering opportunities to engage with a book that students, faculty, and staff read. And I'm sure your publisher is very happy about this, because each member of the incoming class of 2022 will receive a copy of the book.
I don't think we had this tradition when I was at Princeton.
No, actually, it was an initiative of President Eisgruber's to start doing the pre-read at all. And these kind of common reading programs for incoming freshmen have become much more common than they used to be. But Princeton is 5-6 years old, I think, now at this point. So
yeah, every copy of the incoming class will get it. The book will also be distributed to current Princeton undergraduates, graduate students, and faculty, and will also be available to staff by request. And it sounds like they've made you available for a number of conversations on the ideas presented in the book over the course of the next school year. So that's kind of a cool thing. Why do you know that? Why they chose your book? Was it just an acknowledgement of the stories? I read Inside Higher Ed and Chronicle of Higher Education every morning. And Sam and I were talking with Will on a previous podcast about this. It seems like every morning there's a story dealing with free speech in some sense. And you think about the problems in universities or the concerns, student debt, the rise of adjunct faculty. It seems like free speech is what's on the top of everyone's mind. Right. And I'm glad to see that Princeton is tackling it head on. I think a lot of the controversy that we saw in 2015, 16, and 17 were a result of not getting in front of it in the same way that the University of Chicago did. But I'll let you speak to it. I mean, well, how did this come about? Did you know they were going to do this?
No, I'm extraordinarily honored, as you'd expect from President Eisgruber's choice. I mean, so having the pre-read is an initiative that President Eisgruber launched when he became president of the university. Unlike some places, we don't have a big committee that chooses these. Is basically him making the decision as to what books he wants to use for it. And so, certainly in writing the book, the goal was to write something that I thought would be accessible and useful to college students and parents and others. So it was written with that kind of audience in mind. And I think as President Eisgruber was thinking about books for this coming year, he was thinking in part about what kinds of issues is it important for students to be thinking about, and the campus free speech issue is one of them. And moreover, he's become particularly interested in this. I think a lot of college presidents have. I think there's been some sort of eye-opening experiences with some of the attention that some of these episodes have gotten that has made alumni and donors and trustees of universities pay attention, has made university presidents pay attention to this issue, and think of it as a more important issue than they might have thought of it as being 5 years ago, for example. And I think President Eisgruber is among those that has decided that these campus free speech issues are terribly important to the future of higher education as we know it, and connected that are questions about intellectual diversity and sort of respect and tolerance for the fact that people are going to disagree, they're going to have a wide range of views, and those views ought to be represented on
the
college
mission
campuses.
of Jonathan Haidt and Heterodox Academy, really, to bolster viewpoint diversity on campus. I think I would be derelict in my duty here at FIRE if I didn't mention that Princeton has 2 red light speech codes and 4 yellow light speech codes. So it's got a lot of work to do to come up.
We all have work to do.
Yeah, but Sam, you are our Vice President of Policy Research. Let's talk about some of these policies. It has a red light sexual harassment policy that says that unwelcome verbal or physical behavior which is directed at a person based on sex, gender identity, or gender expression when these behaviors are sufficiently severe and or pervasive to have the effect of unreasonably interfering with an individual's educational experience.
Wait, can I cut you off there for a second?
Yeah, please do, because this is a long sentence.
No, the language that actually...
The issue is the examples, right?
Well, no, the issue is also that the policy prohibits not only sexual harassment, which generally speaking is not protected speech, but also prohibits this very broad category of inappropriate conduct related to sex, gender identity, or gender expression. And it says unwelcome conduct that may not fall under sexual harassment or sexual exploitation, but that is sexual in nature. Sexually offensive gestures and comments. So it's basically saying we prohibit not only sexual harassment, but also inappropriate conduct that doesn't rise necessarily to the level of sexual harassment. And when you're talking about that, then you're talking about potentially almost anything. And so that's, I think, the examples here of potentially sexually harassing conduct like sexist jokes or disparaging remarks about sex, I mean, those are concerning, although, if you tie them to Princeton's definition of sexual harassment, which does require conduct that's severe and pervasive, is perhaps somewhat less troubling. This broad ban on any inappropriate conduct, which obviously by reference to the comments in here includes verbal conduct, is seriously concerning. And we've reached out to Princeton before about these policies, and their attitude has generally been, well, look, we're very supportive of free speech. And I think that's true. I mean, I don't see a lot of complaints of censorship coming from Princeton. The problem is when you have these policies on the books, there's 2 problems. One is that they lead to self-censorship, right? You never know how many people have read this policy and said, oof, I better steer clear. Second of all, you can't assume that each administration is going to be as protective of free speech as the next. So when you have a policy on the books that allows a university very broad discretion to punish what off campus would be protected speech, then it's a ticking time bomb, right? I mean, it may not be enforced in a way that infringes on free speech by one administration, but it could be by the next. So we always argue very strongly against having these kinds of policies on the books, even when an administration may say, well, we don't enforce that in a way that infringes on free speech rights, which is more or less what Princeton has said. And like I said, I have every reason to believe that's the case, but the policies still shouldn't be on the books.
What's the matter with the IT policy? Put you on the spot.
IT policy prohibits transmitting any inappropriate images, sounds, or messages that violate Princeton's Code of Civility. And again, very broad discretion.
Mm-hmm. I know you didn't write these codes, Professor, but do you want to defend them?
No, I wouldn't necessarily want to defend them, actually. I think that both are probably broader than I would prefer. I haven't looked into them closely in particular and thought about what the alternative language ought to be that would be preferable. But yeah, they do both sweep a little broadly. And I think you're right to think that we ought to be concerned about how these kind of policies are written, both in terms of what the sort of long-term implications are, how they might be administered over time, and also sort of what kind of signals they're sending to students, although I suspect the chilling effect of the policy on the books is probably not that big, because I suspect most students haven't delved into the details of their codes of conduct. And so probably what's more consequential, I think, for chilling effect issues in particular is how they're actually administered on campus. And I would say that as sort of to put on one of my other hats as a political scientist who studies sort of law and courts and how they operate in general, right? It's important not only what the law in the books looks like, but also what law on the ground looks like, and how policies are actually administered in practice. And so sometimes you can have policies that look great as they're written, and yet get administered in ways that are very abusive and problematic from a free speech perspective, and likewise vice versa. And I think one thing that Princeton has been very good at is making sure that these sort of core academic values about free speech and the like have penetrated into the administrative bureaucracy of the university, such that administrators who are not spending most of their time thinking about scholarship or thinking about classroom conversation. Instead, they're spending most of their time thinking about campus life issues and how students interact with each other in dorms and elsewhere, that nonetheless they're very self-conscious about these larger set of concerns, and as a consequence I think have been quite good about how they've administered these things in general. And I think that's often a challenge, right, is how do you get those staffers who are on the ground thinking about these disputes but are not thinking about it from the perspective of a professor, but is thinking about it from the perspective of, I've got these kids fighting in the dorms. and so how do I get them to get along with one another more effectively? And it's important to constantly have a dialogue then about, okay, yeah, I know you have these conflicts in the dorms, but they're dorms on a college campus, and we want to maintain the overall environment of a university that's respectful of the importance of diverse views and free speech, as well as people don't get in fistfights with each other.
Yeah.
It's amazing to me thinking about how these campus bureaucracies have grown, these student life bureaucracies have grown since I was in college. I mean, when I was at Princeton, like, we had an RA who we could go to for issues, and there was some, orientation programming and stuff, but more or less, we were free to do our own thing, which seems, I don't know specifically about Princeton and how that's changed, but just generally, attending administrators' conferences and things like that, that bureaucratic apparatus has grown tremendously on a lot of campuses, and I feel like that's actually related to a lot of, to me, with more bureaucratization, you have more overregulation of students' lives. And, I definitely see the growth in these student life bureaucracies as related to some of what's happening on campus with free speech.
Well, what was it? It was in the mid-aughts when administrators outnumbered faculty for the first time at American college and university campuses, something like that? Yeah.
No, it's expanded dramatically, and it has real consequences for how universities actually operate and how students experience university life, right? I mean, that a significant part of what students are experiencing is not the experience of faculty, not the academic experience, not the experience in the classrooms. And of course, that's always been true because part of their experience is fraternities and all that kind of stuff. But a significant part of their experience with the sort of official structure of the university is their interaction with staff and administrators. And so it's important, I think, that universities not just sort of hive those off and sort of, and it's important for faculty not to just sort of imagine, well, they'll take care of themselves and not my problem. Those things matter for what the culture of the campus is like.
It is sort of amazing because now that I think about it, I'm like, I don't remember having contact with a single administrator. I knew my RA, and there must have been student life. We sometimes had like ice cream break study halls during finals and in the dining room and things like that. But I really can't think of any interaction I had with, and maybe that was just because I was like a nerd who never got in trouble. And but
I think it's genuinely changed, right? I mean, there has been a growth in these things, and with the growth of staff has come, and there's both supply side issues and demand side issues here, but greater orchestration of student life in general. And I think these things come in waves on college campuses, right? So I think there was a period, maybe from the 60s through the 1990s, where things were relatively lax. Students had a sort of particularly wide open space on their own. On the other hand, if you experienced college in the 1940s or 1950s, I suspect it was not filled with staff, but it was filled with a university that understood their mission as being much more hands-on as to how students ought to behave.
My dad went to Princeton in the 60s, and you could get, in serious trouble for having a girl in your room after 8 o'clock,
Right, exactly.
Well, I mean, this is unique to the United States. I studied abroad very, very briefly in Italy, and you don't have so much of students' lives tied up in the university. We began this conversation by talking about the purpose of a university. And I put it out, echoing Nicholas Christakis, as the dissemination, preservation, and creation of knowledge. But that doesn't mean that you need a whole student life infrastructure to regulate how students interact with each other outside of the classroom. I mean, that's a unique American institution, that your entire life is encompassed by this enterprise that you pursue for 2 to 4 years. You also see a little bit of this in England as well, and I think part of that, your life being wrapped up in the university, is why you get these free speech controversies. You don't hear about as many of these from the University of Bologna, for example, because we're seeing the manifest destiny of universities in implementing these policies push further and further off campus. I mean, in the adjudication of Title IX, it no longer rests on whether these things just happen on campus, but in students' private lives with other students off campus is fair game at this point. And the policing of social media, that really has nothing to do with what happens on campus. You can get brought up on campus disciplinary charges and investigated. So to me, this seems like a uniquely American institution, how we approach higher ed, but it doesn't also at the same time seem to me as a necessary approach in order to pursue the core mission of a university. Am I wrong there?
No, I don't think it's a necessary approach to how you do universities, but I think it is pretty embedded in how Americans have approached higher education. It's a little hard to imagine that we're going to fully pull back from all of that.
And there might also be a benefit to it. I mean, the American universities are the best in the world. There's reason people come from across the world to study here, and it might be because of just the robust culture and immersiveness of the education.
No, I think there's no question there are benefits to it. And also, though, there are other unique features of universities that I sometimes find get in the way of the core mission. So we think about intercollegiate sports, for example,
which I participated as a track athlete.
And not quite a similar kind of phenomenon in any place else in the world, right? And so this is sort of a uniquely American feature of higher education, and for lots of students, an extraordinarily important feature of higher education and what they find deeply attractive. And so I think then for universities, there's always a question of how do you balance these other things universities are doing. Sometimes those are useful things, and sometimes they're beneficial things for students and things students want and appreciate. But how do you balance those things without letting them hamper and corrode the central thing universities ought to be doing? And I think sometimes there's a bit of a challenge as to what people really think the central thing universities ought to be doing, right? Is it really the case that the core mission, as I've articulated, is about advancing, disseminating knowledge, or is the core mission something else? And for some, I think they think the core mission of the university might be something else.
Yeah, well, we did a study here at FIRE that Sam tipped her hat to this earlier, where we polled, something like 2,500 students on their attitudes about free speech, and to sort of preface that polling, we asked, what is the purpose? Why are you going to college? And most of them said to get a job,
right?
Which I think more intersects with the trade school mission than really necessarily the liberal arts or humanities mission. I want to close out this conversation because this podcast will come out at the end of May. Schools will be wrapping up. Most schools, if they don't operate on a quarter system, if they operate on a semester system, will have been done by early May. We haven't seen as many of the large headline-grabbing conflagrations that we saw in 2017, and we also haven't seen as many commencement disinvitations as we have in past years, Sam. I think part of that is a result of universities just selecting the most sanitized, uncontroversial, boring commencement speakers that they can to avoid these. And this is something that my colleague Greg Lukianoff predicted in 2014 when this was really capturing headlines. But as a result, have things gotten better on campus this year, or have universities just gotten better at avoiding the controversies that would cause these conflagrations? I don't know where I land on that. I think we are approaching education in a more sanitized, careful way as a result of what happened from 2015 to 2017. I don't know that it's so much got better as we've just gotten better at self-censoring and avoiding controversial topics.
Yeah, I think it's a little of both. I think things probably have gotten better, and I think partially it's probably the case that we're avoiding some things that might have caused controversy. So I recently did a little project where I was looking at commencement speakers and who actually is getting invited to, so not focusing on the disinvitation part, but the sort of initial announcements and who's being invited to be commencement speakers in the first place. And certainly one thing you worry about is and commencement speakers fundamentally, right, are not terribly important at the end of the day.
And they don't often say anything terribly important during their speech.
Right. This is not the core feature of the university of advancing knowledge, but I think they are. But the thing that you worry about with them is they're indicative of a larger cultural problem on a campus and how open is the campus to a set of ideas. And one thing striking, if you look across sort of hundreds of commencement speakers, for example, is that relatively few of them are people that are clearly associated with ideas in general, or are likely to be saying or representing things that are very controversial. It's a lot of people who have inspirational personal stories, or people who are wealthy alums or successful alums of a university who get invited to give commencement addresses. And that's a safe strategy in lots of ways, right? If you invite an astronaut to give your commencement address because they have an inspirational personal story, that's valuable to students on the one hand, and it's also true they're probably not going to get disinvited, right?
Yeah.
And lead to controversy. On the other hand, if you bring somebody in who is associated with a set of ideas and views that are potentially controversial, then potentially some students are going to object, and then you're going to shut that down potentially. It is a little striking, though, if you look at the set of commencement speakers who are identified with ideas and particular perspectives, they're overwhelmingly of the left. So it's a perfectly safe choice for a lot of universities to invite people who aspire to be presidential candidates in the Democratic Party. It's not at all a safe choice to invite people who aspire to be presidential candidates in the Republican Party, for example. So there's this asymmetrical quality as well.
Yeah, Jonathan Haidt talked about this in the debate that I think is going to be the podcast before this one that we hosted in Greenwich Village the other night. He said in New England in particular, there's been a number of commencement speeches given by Democratic politicians, but not a single one by a Republican politician. And if you look where people like Mike Pence has given his commencement speeches, I mean, it's very rarely a college in the Northeast. It's usually almost always a college associated with conservative ideas, like Hillsdale, for example. It's this only safe place, safe to appropriate a word, safe space for a conservative to give a commencement speech. And I can sort of understand why presidents would want to invite uncontroversial speakers for commencement. You have your alumni in town. You have, this is a celebratory occasion. Parents are in town. The risk just isn't worth the reward. And commencement speeches, as I said, have always been sort of blah. It's rare that you get one like Steve Jobs gave back in the late aughts that gets millions of views on YouTube for its insights and motivations. But they are the most vocal or most prominent people invited to a campus in any year. So to the extent that there's any disinvitations, I think it speaks to sort of the culture.
No, it's worrisome if I mean, one, it can be worrisome as to what counts as safe and controversial, right? So if inviting Hillary Clinton to speak on your campus is the obviously safe and uncontroversial thing to do, but on the other hand, inviting Ted Cruz to your college campus, the obviously controversial, not safe thing to do, then we've got a bit of a problem as well as sort of what the scope of debate and ideas and arguments are going to look like on a college campus in general. But it's even more worrisome if the reaction to that is to pull back and say, okay, we're going to invite Snooki to be your commencement speaker, as Rutgers did at one point.
Did they really?
Instead of
Snooki is the Jersey Shore reality television.
Those are the moments that just make me think, okay, Earth has jumped the shark. Time to find another planet.
So, but on the other hand, that they had protests when they invited Condoleezza Rice to come do the commencement address, right? And so if you start looking around saying, okay, well, we don't want somebody that's going to cause protest and unhappiness because that's embarrassing and for a commencement speaker, then the safe choice not only becomes let's move left, but the safe choice also becomes it's not quite fair, but say, let's dumb it down. And we'll go with a movie star, or we'll go with a pop singer, and that will be your commencement speaker. And it's an unfortunate thing if our universities are at a point where the the kind of speaker that's acceptable to bring to campus that you know is not going to cause controversy is somebody who you can count on to come and say things that aren't very interesting and is not associated with anything that's very interesting. That's the only thing that's really going to be safe and tolerable on a college campus. If that's where we are, then we've lost the crucial thing that college campuses are supposed to be about, which is places where people can argue about ideas and take ideas very seriously. And it's a little embarrassing for an institution that's committed to the notion of we're going to take ideas very seriously. And by the way, your commencement speaker is going to be a reality TV show star. Right?
Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there because we got a lunch to get to. Professor Whittington, I want to thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Sam, thank you as well.
Thanks.
For coming and hanging out with your former professor. Let's try and, I mean, Princeton, again, I've been doing this since 2010 when I first started as an intern here at FIRE. I haven't seen any big free speech controversy at Princeton where the administration has done something wrong, in my opinion, though I could be missing something. And the mere fact that they're assigning your book as the pre-read speaks to their concerns about free speech and taking them seriously, and the defense of Professor Lawrence Rosen, I think, was admirable, but it'd be great to get their policies reformed. The 2 red light ones, the 4 yellow light ones. You know, when the University of Chicago did its committee on free expression, it followed that up with policy reformations because you don't want to speak out of 2 sides of your mouth. So let's hope Princeton can do the same, and let's hope that's part of the conversation that as a result of this pre-read. So thank you again for coming. Sam, thank you for being here, and we'll continue the conversation.
Thank you.
Sounds good.
Professor Whittington's book is Speak Freely, Why Universities Must Defend Free Speech, and it can be found wherever fine books are sold. This podcast is hosted and produced by me, Nico Perrino, and recorded and edited by Aaron Reese. To learn more about So to Speak, you can follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/freespeechtalk, or you can like us on Facebook at facebook.com/So to Speak podcast. You can also email us feedback at sotospeak@thefire.org. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving us a review on iTunes or wherever else you get your podcasts. As I remind you every week, this helps us attract new listeners to the show. And until next time, thanks for listening.